How'd you like it? How'd you like my Mishulovich? You know, I finished that video for Mishulovich right before I got called to go get my new key to the door. Is that what you got underwriting the profile on that on the new lock on the door? How did I do? Whoever it is that you got that's writing the profile, whoever it is that's supposed to be working these accounts that are going to be connected to the bid associated with what just got put on that door. How was I? Did I do pretty good? Was it good enough? Do you like the inflection? Does it seem a little callous? I mean, it's the kind of attitude you want. Let me ask you, do you want that attitude because it's attractive to you? And maybe it's the kind of thing you resonate with? Or do you want that attitude because then you can justify saying that there is some sort of behavioral problem with it, and then when you continue to slander, and when you continue to misrepresent, and when you continue to completely fabricate the circumstances connected to it, not because you've been given misinformation and you may be presenting that information inaccurately based upon the actual facts because it was communicated to you inaccurately, but just because you needed to embellish it. I mean, you're just so, you're trying to make a point. The point is nothing you said or did was actually honest. You've been trying for fucking years to get me to fucking agree, to see and agree to be that which I absolutely fucking oppose. I think it's like you're supposed to step into you're supposed to step into your enemy and have compassion and understand what they're going through. In 1995, it was perfectly capable of having a discussion about cybernetics. It was absolutely capable at that time of discussing bioenergy and how people's biological energy can be monitored, and that how our hormones and our emotions can actually alter the energy signature of our actual bioresonance, and that can have an impact on the production quality of our actual bioenergy. And that if we're in a closed network or something akin to a nationalized sector that just collectively harvest either based on a specific geographic location or a specific classification, maybe connected to somebody's actual participation in a job role through their particular work, or maybe it's something you choose, including in connection with political representation, that you allow for a certain characterization of you as a group, and then within that group you make certain kinds of contributions with certain attributes, and then that is allowed to produce a certain kind of quality that then gets circulated into various networks, including networks that can monitor it and that can assess it and can potentially even regulate it, including in a manner that once you achieve consciousness and you've engaged in a process of effective, accurate automation because you know what's going on and you understand your role, that then you can just participate. And so you can be producing, but you can also be consuming. And when it comes to matters related to rates or overextending the actual production based upon the capacity to actually transmit, then you have people that have job roles that are responsible for that. And because you know what's going on, if you have a problem with the programming, or if there's something going on in the automation that causes you harm, that causes you pain, that is trying to compel you to do something that is not connected to what is literally necessary in your actual purview, you know either who to check in with and how to represent what's going on so they can make adjustments and then they can confirm with you, or you can self-regulate. The problem is how much of the hyper exploitation of the capitalist economy is based on derivative and leveraging risk based upon being able to trigger a specific derivative within a specific time-space unit. So that's what you either get credit for or that's what you take the hit on. See, we would have a lot fewer derivatives and a lot less utility for derivatives. And I say utility deliberately, but we would also have a lot less market volatility, as well as market opportunity, if we actually had to say what we mean and we had to back it up through what we do. I'm sorry, did I talk about prostitution there? No, I didn't. Did I talk about pussy banks there? No, I didn't. Is it potentially an area for discussion of illegal coinage? Absolutely. But that's not the point. Because in the last 20 years, you did not allow for consideration of that level of discourse around slaves of Chicago. International sex trafficking is becoming big business. You see, it's not just about those exotic Russians, right? It's actually a relatively minor aspect of the overall article. But I probably look more Russian than Thai, don't I? And if you're talking about coinage, what do you really want as a quality indicator of your coinage, especially if you're trying to leverage? If you're trying to increase the distance between each margin in order to make it more exciting, right? It's amazing, just my own vocal range, how much leverage I can get with just my voice, even without makeup. Hmm? Isn't that what you wanted? Isn't that what took 20 years to cultivate? And that's why you waited 20 years to acknowledge it? And you didn't actually even confirm it, did you? Because you want to leave open that ambiguity, plausible deniability. Okay, let's go through this article. I wrote this article by myself, 100% by myself. I did the research, I got the press releases, I read through the reports, I did the phone calls. I wrote it, it got published. Does this article in 2001, written by somebody who was what? How old was I? Early 20s? I was not old enough to run for Congress. I had not graduated college. I was a journalist that learned on the job. I was a professional journalist. At the time I wrote this was a freelance contribution to another publication in the same city, but I was a newspaper editor at the time. I was a managing editor at the time I wrote this. By reading this and basing it upon what was recorded and reported as fact, as the primary source reference material at the time, does this show the capacity for a young woman at this stage in her life approaching this topic to potentially be the kind of person that 20 years later could file a criminal petition to prosecute a criminal drug conspiracy? It's a very simple question. What's reflected in here? The way it's approached? Is there demonstrable proof that this personally could have provided evidence to attest to the fact that this woman had the competence, the capability, and the intent of following through on addressing factors mentioned in this article, up to and including that at later points in time, when she was attempted for enticement into cooperating with the very criminal syndicates she had reported on earlier, that she would have consciously, cognizantly, and determinately pursued a course of action in order to address factors associated with what was represented in this article as fact at the time. What does it say? Okay, you don't like the headline? See, because if you only get to the headline, that says something. And I know, I've spent the last couple of years tracking what happens if you just go at it with the headline. You can get a lot. A lot can be yielded just with the headline, right? A lot can be yielded just with the headline, just with the byline. But what if you actually get into the substance? What if you actually read it? Okay, $7 billion in 2001. Now, if you're looking at it for a course of 20 years, right? $7 billion. Okay. When we start talking about Chinatown, I started with talking about Chinatown and the Chicago police. What's the next major reference point I have? The Chicago police? Well, March 24th of 2010, right? Now, I was in San Francisco. So I was supposed to be thinking about a federal legislative effort that went into effect on March 24th of 2010. But what happened in the city of Chicago on March 24th of 2010, specific to the Chicago police? Now, to be fair with you, I did not know that in 2010. I didn't find that out until 2017. Right? So it took 7 years from the time it went into effect for me to get the actual information I needed. Let's continue. Travel fees. This is one thing. Upon the arrival, they were forced in blah blah to pay off their travel fee. What's considered a travel fee? You mean like when you're working at a job and you have to leave early because they've compromised your safety and you're supposed to be able to get your last paycheck to pay for your transportation? but because you are trying to take a mode of transportation they do not agree with, they just withhold your paycheck and then tell you you owe them the cost of transportation, or you have to find somebody else. So you have to call somebody else in another city and spend a substantial amount of time defining and explicating with this person whether or not it was a donation or whether or not you owe them a payment, some sort of repayment of their cost of the travel fee. What was this one regarding? So you're in a professional context as an educator of youth below the age of legal consent, and you're being required to ingest unprescribed, unverified prescription medications in front of them in order to sleep inside. And your determination is you have to leave the country. And then they start arguing about travel fees. Is that comparable? Is it equivalent? Do you need to actually address matters related to the sex act? Let's continue. Immigration and Naturalization Services, decisions about what to do. Specific case, 1995, Riga, Latvia. You like that one? Mr. Riga, member of the State Bar, Texas, presumably working on a report concerning extremist Islam, the only person available that day to provide the notarization on, what was that? In re Charity Colleen Crouse, petition for writ of habeas corpus, Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. You remember that one? Now, this is not in 1995. This is more than 20 years later. 2017. 22 years later. I'm not in Riga, Latvia. I'm in Riga's office, right? Where are we going here? Okay, then in Chicago, having to deal with clubs, one in Chicago, one in the suburbs. I see. Special agent, this special agent has a very distinct name. It's not an uncommon name. You know who now is Michael Brown? Michael Brown is now an author at a publication I used to publish with. What's my relationship with being able to contact an FBI special agent about trafficking? Now, would that be the kind of thing that would be considered of protected information, confidential information? Would it? Unless, of course, somebody speculated on you needing to get a mobility assistance device because you're a senior and your husband, who's retired from the military and used to be involved in construction of aircraft, has his estate tied up in a proceeding that has made you temporarily homeless, so you have to go through a shelter. And the benchmark to meet the hedge put on you being able to get that mobility assistance device just so happens to be at an actual military installation. But who's going to make it? Who's going to know about that time frame? Who's going to even keep track of your case that long? That was how many years after 1997? 22. All right, let's keep going. These specific clubs. One of these clubs in Chicago, they have the same name. I'm sorry, the one in Chicago is different than the one in Harvey. Harvey, Illinois has a club that has the same name as a housing development in Houston. How long between this and Hurricane Harvey? 20 years. 20 years. Nice. Where are we going? FBI agents. 4 men currently await sentencing. 1 got away. You know what that sounds like? Have you ever read any opinions by the attorneys general in Texas? It's one attorney general, but he's always got 4 people from his office signing on for him. Mishulovich got away. The other 4 were convicted and, at least at that time, were awaiting sentencing. Let's see. Okay, UN report, Lives Together, Worlds Apart, by the UN Population Fund. Where do you think the UN Population Fund stands these days in the time of COVID-19 in regards to issues concerning the trafficking of women and girls? That's a very important question. I'll make sure to follow up on that one for you. Where are we at now? Ah, then we have other trafficking cases, not specifically and exclusively about Riga, right? Where do we have? Mexico to Florida and the Carolinas, Czech Republic to New York, Thailand into various US cities. Different spectrum. There's a whole spectrum of their treatment. Some had no hope for emancipation. That was the way it was identified. No hope for emancipation. I hope they're not minors, because then you would have to insert a lawyer, right? Okay, worked off their debts. I see. Ah, and some of them even had a certain number of people. If you actually service this many clients, then you will have been understood to have met your quota, and so you will no longer be responsible for that specific advance that was given to you. You will have paid back your advance after you've serviced this number of clients. Am I correct? That sounds about right. And it's Thailand. See, the thing is, this gives a range of about what, 20%? There's a 20% spread here. For Thailand, they don't do that anymore. They've gotten much, much, much more precise, haven't they? And they got much, much, much more precise very shortly after this article was written. Just a little over 9 minutes, a little over 7 months. A little over 7 months later. 8 months. 8 months later. A little over 8 months later. Wow. All right. Now we have a reference to a nonprofit organization, which will qualify as an NGO or charity, which is absolutely necessary in order for this to actually set in motion a kind of transactional process necessary for the end result, right? Which is to get everybody out of being trafficked, right? Including the state of mind where you understand that you didn't agree to do that. That wasn't actually what you agreed to. It wasn't actually what you wanted to do, right? At what stage does the psychological pressure actually create the change and the alteration of your understanding of your reality? Did he really tell her she was going to be a bikini dancer? Did they even have that kind of marketing in 1995? Law enforcement officials are ill equipped. Let's see. Okay, see, this is where it gets deep because we've already had the transition through the charity. And what are we dealing with? Well, now we're talking about compare and contrast with actual laws, including statutes regarding the application or implementation of penalties for violation of those laws. But in order for you to be able to get an appropriate prosecution, what do you need? Well, if nothing else, you need that police report. You need for the police to understand what the crime is. And when they fill out the actual report and they record the scene, the state of mind of the witness or the person involved, they catalog the evidence. And then, if necessary, they put themselves into a situation where they maintain their own professional credibility so that they can actually provide testimony at the trial, right? Yeah. Is that what you mean by ill equipped? What part of that lacked equipping? Did they not have enough pens at the time? It was that, book that has the tickets in triplicate, right? Okay. Did they not have the digital interface of the actual mobile device where they could actually type it in, or even some sort of audio equipment where they could give a voice report and then the voice report would transcribe into the actual report? Did they not have the capacity to take what they did on scene and then follow it up later when they were in the actual office? And did they have some problem with putting that from that actual report and their editing, or rather their proofreading of their own report, into the database, so that then it was allowed to be put into the database and been identifiable in terms of having to compile information, maybe to analyze trends or to cross-reference with allegations or identification of potential culprits, in order to potentially engage in law enforcement prevention efforts when they've identified circumstances that sound equivalent to what they've already recorded in the reports? See, that's not the kind of thing maybe somebody would give you a training on in terms of legislation, in terms of the actual specific psychological or psycho-emotional responses of women or men that are being trafficked, including sex trafficked. but those are all very technical, practical skills you should have anyway as a law enforcement officer. Am I correct? So, what makes the distinction between filing a police report that includes information that can substantiate and justify an understanding of the charges of trafficking and the attendant crimes associated with trafficking, and the capacity for that to actually make it into a prosecution? Okay, so here we go into talking about sentences. Sentences for specific crimes. The inadequacy of current legislation. Well, it says the inadequacy of current legislation. How then, let me ask you, 20 years later, how does one move forward on creating, crafting, or refining existing legislation so that it can actually have what is needed, presumably legislatively, to back up actual law enforcement efforts? What do you need? What do legislators need in order to be able to provide? Let me ask you a question. Somebody walks into your office, Senator, and hands you a printout of a proposed piece of legislation. What does it take for you to get that information that is in that proposed piece of legislation and get it passed into law to be able to support law enforcement? Do you need law enforcement to provide reports that attest to a need? Do you need prosecutors to do their job and actually create precedents for allowing prosecution under existing law? See, because what I've been getting instead is that what people need is health insurance. And in order to get health insurance, everything else first has to do certain things that can be billed through health insurance. So let me ask you a question. What role does that police report play in the event she has to go to the hospital? Yeah, that's the big deal, right? See, that wasn't in the article at the time. And that's the kind of information that people that know about want to say they want to keep confidential. Why? We're 20 years later, aren't we? And somebody didn't like the attitude. Is this attitude inadequate? What if is this not an attitude that Alex Mishulovich should have? I see. Okay, let's continue. Okay. The report cited here was from the CIA, and it's true the CIA was the one that had the report at the time, and they're talking about the accommodations. What is actually capable of helping the women exit the situation? You know what is not good to assist women who have been trafficked in extrication from trafficking syndicates? The CIA. Or those alleging that their activities are covered under the rubric of the CIA, up to and including an understanding that the only real legislative support they're going to be able to obtain is by reference through the Intelligence Committee in manners that refuse to take any responsibility for the abuse of or by the Department of State, including in connection with laws regarding immigration that get to the next thing on the list here or in the article, which is visas and the provision of visas to people so that they can be protected while they offer testimony against the criminals. That's not actually how it works, right? Let me ask you a question. You go into the police and you say to the police you're being trafficked or you've witnessed somebody being trafficked. Do you need to show them your passport? Do they already know whether or not somebody took your passport from you? I believe they do, don't they? At least in certain areas of high trafficking activity. Okay. Cooperation. It's a lot different to cooperate if your only resource networks for survival are ones that are consistently engaged in protracted efforts to defame, degrade, and to attempt to undermine any sort of possibility for successful cooperation with law enforcement, because the access to resources you have at your availability are often predicated on the concept that people accused of crimes are accused of crimes unjustly and hence deserve to have a defense provided by officers of the law who otherwise should be prosecuting crime. So even if you do get to be a part of that intercession of the judicial branch between law enforcement and legislation, if you're actually being trafficked, including for the purposes of prostitution, at what point do you actually even get to intersect with the judicial branch of government? especially if the police won't take a report, and especially if the police do take a report and the report is completely mischaracterized because they have some other interest. And even if you say, I know that it is required for you to have certification and training in how to respond to this situation. Well, are we talking about something else besides, we're talking about some other business, right? Are we talking about something else that might be impacted if it was recorded as fraud? Especially if you're trying to use medical insurance? Okay, those are, see, now we're dissipating. We're not keeping strictly with what's here. This is the best part. Cooperation between the United States and other countries. Where are they cooperating with? Scandinavian countries. Does that include Norway? Does that include Norway? Does that include Norway in concert with international security paradigms that understand the role of using people to smuggle guns, drugs, chemical or biological weapons, other kinds of weapons, pirated software, including pirated software that could be used for hacking, industrial espionage? Okay. So there would be a legitimate reason for 20 years later, instead of actually addressing issues related to the trafficking of women and children, including trafficking of women and children in concert with a mischaracterization of a global health pandemic that is actually a part of another paradigm associated with how and in what manner it becomes for traffickers viable to persist in using actual human beings in these situations, i.e. trafficking things that are otherwise illegal, indisputably illegal, except even though there are international conventions against chemical and biological weapons, somehow we don't even call them chemical and biological weapons anymore. We call them something else. We call them healthcare, don't we? So unfortunately, cooperation with the Scandinavian countries is still kind of sketchy. Eastern Europe? You mean the Balkans? I see. Ultimately, prevention is key. And it begins with improving conditions for all women throughout the world. Have we succeeded? See, if you don't agree to, accept, and accede to their characterization of what is a woman that has been availed of a movement for supporting women's liberation or women's rights, does that mean you're not allowed to be a woman anymore? Is that what transgender really is? That there is a political identity as woman, and that political identity has specific political capital associated with it. And that political capital has already been claimed by other people. And if you want a piece of it for yourself, you have to work for it. And if you work for it and you show loyalty to the brand, you might get to wear it yourself one day. And if you don't, well, you're not a woman. And I'm not trafficking women. That's what you've told me. That's where we are 20 years later. I see. Is this a better comportment? Would this meet what you would be considering a behavioral conditioning? It demonstrated that there had been some success in whatever it was that you misappropriated this for at the time it was written and allowed to accrue. And because I won't cede my identity of who I was, and because I actually wrote the damn thing myself, this is where we are 20 years later with it. I see.